Have you ever sprayed chemicals over and over again, only to find the bugs returning just a few days later? Have you ever stood before the shelves of a garden center, looking at the overwhelming array of products, and wondered which one actually works? Holes multiply on the leaves, fruits are scarred, seedlings weaken, and all the while your money slowly drains away. Have you ever felt that way? Conversely, have you ever looked at a field that is hardly ravaged and wondered what on earth that person is doing? Perhaps what was lacking was not a stronger chemical, but the very way of facing pests itself. One day, that suspicion began to take a clear shape within me. It was when I visited a small vegetable garden on the outskirts of Holmes County. To be honest, I expected to see something much more special: expensive tools, superior commercial products, a secret chemical they wouldn't want to tell anyone. I thought it was precisely because they had such things that their field was kept so calm. However, what stopped me in my tracks was something anticlimactically simple. Hanging from a low stake at the edge of the field was a single-cut plastic bottle. The top part was inverted and inserted into the bottom, forming a funnel shape. Every time the wind blew, the bottle swayed just a little. When I got closer and looked at the bottom, there were many insects accumulated inside. Small flies, winged beetles, insects like moths that fly at night. Mixed in were even things resembling bees that would be troublesome if they stung you. Rather than feeling a chill, I was first taken aback. It seemed that this incredibly simple thing was doing a much more logical job than the commercial products I had relied on for years. There was no flashy mechanism. It was just hanging there quietly. Yet that bottle was certainly fulfilling its role to protect the field. I couldn't help but ask, what is inside this? The owner of the garden smiled slightly and gave a very brief answer. Sugar water and a little patience. The moment I heard those words, I became even more confused. Sugar water and a little patience. Could just that produce such a result? If that was truly the case, what had I been buying? What had I been believing in? And what had I been overlooking all this time? The same questions echoed in my mind over and over. Later, as I looked into it, I gradually came to understand the reason. Most pests do not arrive in a garden by chance. A fermented odor serves as a strong signal to insects. There might be food there. There might be weakened fruit. There might be a suitable place to lay eggs. Insects sense the signals that foster such expectations much more acutely than we realize. The same goes for color. The same goes for shape. Even things that appear to humans merely as bottles or boards can to insects serve a role like a mark indicating the direction they should head. Once you begin to understand that mechanism pest control ceases to be about pushing through with force, rather than eradicating everything, the concept emerges of observing which insect is drawn to what and where it is heading, and then shifting its course. From that day on, what wavered most significantly within me was my trust in commercial chemicals, was my habit of trying to find peace of mind by immediately spraying something every time I found a bug truly correct. If they quieted down for a few days, but then returned, wasn't that failing to solve the problem? Moreover, if each time I did that, I was reducing not only the pests, but also the insects that had been helping the garden, then perhaps I had been putting my own field at a disadvantage for a long time. On my way home, the image of that plastic bottle floated into my mind again and again. It was not merely a contrivance to save money. That quiet trap directed a much more fundamental question at me. Perhaps what I lacked wasn't a stronger chemical. Perhaps what I needed was the courage to reconsider what was happening in the garden from the very beginning. Since that day, I could no longer look at my own garden with the same eyes as before. Until then, whenever holes opened in the leaves or soft new shoots were chewed, I thought of chemicals almost reflexively. I was only thinking about finding something that looked effective, dealing with it immediately, and quickly stopping the damage visible right now. Every time I looked at the sprays and powders lined up on the shelves of the garden center, I expected that this time, this will settle things. If I buy something new, the situation might change a little. The more I read the explanations written on the labels, the stronger that feeling became. And indeed, sometimes it would quiet down for a few days. But after a while, the insects would return again. Sometimes, after seeming to decrease in number, they would even return as more of a nuisance than before. For a long time, I blamed it on the season. Maybe it's the weather. It must be a bad year for bugs. Maybe it's the soil. Maybe it's the seedlings. In that way, I was searching for reasons outside of my own methods. However, every time I remembered that simple bottle hanging at the edge of that garden, that way of thinking gradually became unsustainable. Why did something so simple seem to fulfill such a logical role? Why had I been constantly searching for something stronger, something with a broader effect? As I thought about this, I was forced to face an inconvenient truth. I thought I was only dealing with pests, but in reality, hadn't I been simultaneously reducing the insects that supported the garden? In a garden, there are small companions playing important roles, even if they do not stand out. Ladybugs walking on the undersides of leaves, beetles searching for prey near the soil, parasitic wasps too small to be easily noticed. Without me asking anything of them, those insects had been silently helping to keep the pest numbers in check. Yet the moment I saw damage, I prioritized immediate peace of mind by spraying broad-spectrum chemicals. Desperate to stop the damage, I had never deeply considered how widely it would affect things. Thinking about it now, while intending to protect the garden, I might have been driving away its allies. When I thought of that, a slight heaviness settled deep in my chest. At the same time, there was a strange lightness. If the core of the problem wasn't the abundance of insects, but my own way of facing them, it also meant there was still room to change my approach. And so the very meaning of the term pest control began to change within me. Eradicating everything is not management. I came to feel that what must come first is looking at what is happening in the garden and knowing which insect came from where and what it is drawn to. Some insects are drawn to fermented odors. Some insects react to bright colors. Some trace damp paths and emerge during the night. The way damage appears has a pattern, and that pattern always has a reason. If you turn your eyes to that, there is no need to try and clean up everything with the same method. I began to believe that for each individual problem, there must be a smaller, more targeted approach. As I started thinking this way, those brief words gradually gained weight in my mind. Don't buy what you can make. Just because you can clear it away with poison doesn't mean it's the best way. Don't turn all of nature into an enemy. Discern only the opponent causing trouble. That stance was not just old-fashioned wisdom. It was a very practical way of thinking. People whose gardens look settled might not just be lucky. They might observe well, and rather than rushing to stop everything, they might be taking action tailored to the specific opponent. Finally, I too was beginning to turn my eyes in the same direction. Which insect chews the leaves? Which insect approaches the fruit? Where does it easily get damp, and where serves as an invasion route? Once you begin to ask such questions, the way the garden looks changes astonishingly. The phenomena I previously thought were merely a nuisance gradually change into things that can be read. Beyond that change, handmade traps cease to be mere money-saving tricks. I began to see each one as a tool to turn the insect's behavior against them. They were not for erasing everything, but for stopping the right opponent in the right place. When I realized that I finally wanted to try the same thing in my own garden. What flies in, what crawls out, and what eats the leaves during the night. If the opponent is different, what they are drawn to and how to stop them are also different. I think I had left that obvious fact unseen for a very long time. That is exactly why now I wanted to confirm things one by one. What kind of scent calls what? What kind of mechanism is suited for what kind of pest? The way to protect a garden is not only by suppressing it with force. That realization was finally beginning to take shape within me. Once I stopped looking at the garden as a single consolidated problem, things became mysteriously organized. Until then, if leaves were chewed, they all looked like the same enemy, and if something was flying, I only thought about driving it away no matter what. However, As I began to observe a little more calmly, there were proper distinctions. Insects that fly in, things that crawl out during the night, those that prefer damp places, those drawn to scents, those drawn to colors. Once I became able to divide and consider them one by one like this, the countermeasures suddenly looked realistic. Before I wanted to know what would have the strongest effect, but now I wanted to know what was calling that insect. That shift was a major starting point for me. The first thing I tried was that simple bottle trap I had seen at the edge of the field that day. I prepared a large plastic bottle, cut off the top part, inverted it, and inserted it into the main body. The shape is merely a funnel, but this shape was very important. Insects drawn in by the scent find it easy to go down, but they cannot easily pass back through the small entrance to get outside. First, I dissolved sugar in lukewarm water and poured it into the bottom of the bottle. Sometimes I left it as is for a few days to ferment naturally, and sometimes I added a small amount of dry yeast to make the scent rise faster. What was important here was that it wasn't merely sweet water. After a little time, the presence of fermentation had to emerge. Freshly made sugar water is just sweet. But once fermentation begins, the scent changes. That scent, even if it is nothing significant to humans, serves as a strong signal to insects. There might be food there. There might be ripe, softened fruit. It has the power to make them think so. I did not hang that bottle in the middle of the field. I placed it on the outer edge. This is because I thought it made more sense to put it in a place where the wind would carry the scent and insects would notice it before entering the field. Also, I made sure to avoid places with many flowers or places where pollinating insects often gathered. I no longer wanted to return to the mindset that it was fine as long as I caught a lot. What was important was to narrow down the target opponent as much as possible. When I peeked inside about 2 days later, a greater number of insects than I had expected had accumulated at the bottom. Rather than being surprised by the result, I was finally convinced. I realized that even if it wasn't expensive, if it matched the insect's behavior, it would do its job this quietly. After that, I began to turn my eyes to other types of damage. Sometimes in the morning, the edges of lettuce leaves would be finely scraped away, or young strawberry leaves would be missing in spots. Everything had been fine the previous evening, yet after one night, the damage suddenly stood out. At such times, the opponent to suspect is not a flying insect. It is slugs and snails, which prefer damp places and begin to move when it gets dark. For this opponent, a different trap was needed. I prepared a shallow container and buried it so that the rim was almost level with the soil surface. Sometimes I used cheap beer, and other times I used a mixture of lukewarm water, a little sugar, and yeast. Here again, the deciding factor was the scent of fermentation. However, I quickly realized upon trying it that the mixture alone was insufficient. If placed in a dry, sunny spot, almost nothing happened. But when I placed it where mulch easily retains moisture in the shade at the edge of a furrow, or around where the damage appeared in the morning, the results changed clearly. I remember well the feeling when I lifted the small container in the morning and looked inside. It was astonishment were there this many, this close. Until then, I had only been looking at the damage and not at the opponent's path. I finally realized that was why I couldn't stop them. Even just by trying these two types of traps, something became clear within me. It is that, whether it is effective or not, does not depend on a mystical secret, but on whether it matches the habits of the opponent. Flying insects have their way of entering, and things that crawl at night have their way of moving. Just by observing those habits and setting the traps accordingly, the garden's reaction changed considerably. I no longer felt like I was fighting a massive invisible horde with brute force. Instead, I had come to want to slightly shift the signals the insects relied on and direct them away from the crops. That shift in thinking allowed me to see handmade traps not as mere money-saving tricks, but as quiet, clever tools. And naturally, my eyes began to turn to methods I hadn't tried yet. Perhaps I can alter the destination of insects, not only with scents, but also with colors and height. Thinking this way, It seemed as though many unread clues still remained within the garden. As I observed the garden while trying these scent-based traps, I noticed another important thing. Pests do not always move solely attracted by scent. Among them, some insects react to what first catches their eye. At first I wondered if it was necessary to care about such things. But when I looked a little closer, there were more landmarks for insects in the garden than I had thought. Bright colors, soft-looking new shoots, surfaces that stand out from the surroundings. What appears merely as a difference in color to a human can become a reason to approach for a small insect. Until then, when looking at plants, I had only cared about leaf color and vigor. Is there enough water? Is it lacking fertilizer? How ripe is the fruit? I had only been looking with that perspective. However, insects are looking at something else. As I came to understand that difference, the countermeasures too became visible in yet another form. So I tried an adhesive trap using bright yellow. It is nothing special. A yellow plastic plate or thick paper is fine. I prepared a conspicuous yellow board and coated one side with something sticky. Sometimes I used commercial gardening products, and sometimes I used easy-to-find alternatives. What is important is that it is a yellow color that easily catches the insect's eyes, and that once they land, they stay there. I attached it to a low stake and placed it to match the height of the crop, showing damage. If I was concerned about small insects flying around the leaves, I brought it close to the leaf height. If I was concerned about insects flying just above the soil surface around seedlings, I placed it lower. When I tried it, I found that slight difference changed the results. Even with the same trap, if the height is different, the opponent it reaches is also different. When I first placed this yellow trap, I didn't have very high expectations. Its appearance was just too simple. It's just a yellow board that bugs stick to. And yet when I went to check a few days later, numerous small dot-like things had multiplied on it. Looking closely, they were the tiny flying insects that had been drifting around the leaves. Some were whitish, some were slender. On the ones placed near the soil, there were even truly tiny insects that had been fluffily flying around the seedlings. It was then that I realized for the first time just how many tiny movements there were in my own garden. I had missed them simply because they were too small to follow with the eye, but in reality the precursors to damage had begun much earlier. The usefulness of this yellow trap was not just because it caught insects. It was because it told me what was beginning to multiply and where. If you can notice them while the numbers are still small, you can change your own course of action. There is a world of difference in the burden on the garden between frantically doing something after the damage has spread and noticing at the stage when there is just a presence. Little by little, I came to understand that noticing early is much more important than taking strong action immediately. A trap is not merely a tool to stop an opponent. It is also a tool that tells you what is happening in the garden in a visible form. As that sense developed, I became able to face other damage occurring during the night more calmly than before. Seedling leaves that were healthy in the evening are chewed from the edges by morning. In severe cases, freshly planted seedlings could look weakened overnight. That kind of damage looks slightly different from insects flying around the leaves during the day. Therefore, I became more conscious of crawling pests that move at night. However, for this opponent, I didn't place traps blindly and widely. I narrowed down the locations considerably. Instead of setting them up equally everywhere, I directed them only to the places where damage was actually occurring. That makes it easier to read what is happening and saves me from meddling with the entire garden more than necessary. I used a small, wide-mouthed container and put in a slightly thick, sweet liquid. Sometimes I used something with a heavy sweetness, like molasses thinned with lukewarm water, and placed it near the seedlings in the spots where nighttime feeding damage was appearing. What was important here was not so much what mixture I used, but where I placed it. Just because you are worried, lining up the same things all over the garden has little meaning. There is a reason where a problem occurs, and it is precisely because you place the trap close to that reason that it holds meaning. Through that way of thinking, I gradually let go of the panicked feelings within myself. If you rush and try to do everything at once, the garden becomes increasingly incomprehensible. But looking at one instance of damage, checking one location, and placing one contrivance there, that repetition transformed my stance in dealing with the garden into a quiet one. Before I knew it, I was no longer looking at the garden as a battlefield, but as a map to be deciphered little by little. When you stop looking at pests as a single consolidated nuisance, things more important than the traps themselves become visible. What materials to use is of course important, but that alone is not enough. Where to put it? When to put it? At what interval to check it? Only when those three align does a trap fulfill its true function. I used to think that if a method was effective, doing it once would bring peace of mind for a while. Use a strong one once, and it will be settled. Once placed, it's fine, even if you forget about it for a while. That was how I thought. But what is happening in the garden does not adjust to our convenience. Insects do not move according to the calendar, and they change their movements based on fine conditions like wind direction, moisture temperature, the position of shade, and the state of the crops. In other words, even the right trap becomes weak if placed in the wrong spot, and even good contents will gradually fail to call anything if maintenance is neglected. I once made a fermentation-based bottle trap, and even though the shape and contents shouldn't have been bad, the results were not as expected. My past self would probably have concluded at that point that this method didn't suit my garden. But at that time, I paused and looked at my surroundings. Even though the wind was flowing in from an open direction outside the field, the place where I had hung the trap was slightly off from that flow. So I tried moving it closer to the outer edge, to a position where the scent would seep outside first. Then the situation a few days later was clearly different. I understood then that what had failed was not the method, but the location. The same thing happened with the slug traps. In a dry, sunny place, the inside of the container remains almost empty. However, when placed at the edge of a furrow, where damage appears in the morning, in a place that easily retains moisture, the results changed significantly. I finally came to deeply realize that traps do not work just by being placed. They only hold meaning when they enter the opponent's path. In doing so, 3 criteria became clear within me. First, it must suit the opponent. What is effective for a flying insect is different from what is effective for something crawling at night. Even if the damage looks similar, if the reason they are called is different, the way to stop them also changes. Second, the location must be right. Where does that insect enter? Where does it land on the leaves? Where does moisture easily remain? Even if you just place a trap without looking at such things, it won't work well. Third, the timing must be right. Things that tend to appear in the spring and things that increase after the heat intensifies have different active times and vigor. Moreover, liquid bait loses its scent over time, and adhesive surfaces struggle to fulfill their role once insects accumulate. Even if the appearance remains the same, the function may actually have dropped. That is precisely why I stopped the idea of place it and be done. Rather, I came to think that reviewing it after placing it is more important in garden management. This difference is clearly understood when compared to my past methods. Before, whenever I found a bug, I immediately wanted to use something strong. I wanted to stop it quickly. I wanted it to be widely effective. I wanted to erase the anxiety of the moment I saw the damage all at once. I still understand that feeling well. However, that method was also a way of taking action on the whole, without looking at the center of the problem. It is like spraying water all over the room just because you saw a tiny flame. Where is the source of the fire? What is actually burning? Are there other things to protect? If you act before confirming such things, you end up washing away the things that could help as well. Now, I have begun to look first. What is increasing? Where is it starting? What is that insect drawn to? If I stop it correctly, then perhaps I won't have to take stronger measures. As I started thinking that way, the garden gradually became easier to read. The feeling of being chased around every time damage occurred decreased. and I came to feel that the calmness of a garden is not born from a single strong countermeasure, but from the accumulation of numerous small, correct judgments in correct places. A bottle hung in the path of the wind, a small container placed on a damp path, a yellow board adjusted to the flying height of insects, liquid bait changed before it weakens. Each one is a truly modest thing, but when those small things accumulate, the air of the garden certainly changes. I no longer wanted to settle everything in one day. What is needed is not to hurl the same force at everything, but to give the correct response each time to the signals that become visible. Since I started thinking that way, the time I spent panicking in my own garden decreased. Where does it easily get damp? Which furrow tends to get more small flying insects? Where should I take action immediately? And where is it fine to just continue observing a little? Those differences gradually became visible. It is not that the garden became quieter than before. It is simply that my perspective changed, and the way I used my hands to maintain that quietness finally became settled. As I became able to decipher what was happening in the garden, little by little, the number of pests I could face more calmly than before increased. However, even then, there was an opponent that made my heart heavy almost every year. Japanese beetles. This insect does not appear in a way that causes a massive uproar right from the start. However, once it gains momentum, the speed at which it damages leaves is extremely striking. A leaf that was sturdy until yesterday can be left with only bone-like veins in a very short time. Anyone who grows roses, raspberries, grapes, or fruit trees with soft leaves might recognize that way of being eaten. It starts quietly, but by the time you notice the damage has spread. That feeling was slightly different from other pests. What is troublesome is not that its identity is unknown, but the speed at which it spreads. That is exactly why in the past I was strongly drawn to commercial dedicated traps. They are visually easy to understand and look as though they will definitely work. They come with an attractant, and insects rapidly enter the bag. Looking at such a mechanism, you want to think with this: I'll be safe. However, while researching various things and listening to the stories of experienced people, I began to pause, because appearing to catch a lot and reducing damage in the garden are not necessarily the same thing. Things with strong attractive power sometimes draw insects even from far away. If you make a mistake in where you place it, you might call in more to the surroundings than the number you catch. Thinking that way, I came to feel that assuming the bag getting full itself is a success is perilous. What mattered was not the visible result, but whether the pressure on the plants I wanted to protect truly decreased. Therefore, here too, rather than a flashy method, I chose a slightly quieter one, using overripe fruit. When I had softened bananas, I used those, and if I had them on hand, I also mixed in sweet fruits, like peaches or plums. I put them in a wide-mouthed container, added a little water, and added sugar and just a little yeast. If you leave it for a while, the fruit slowly breaks down and ferments, gradually releasing a distinct odor. Even if it is not a pleasant scent to humans, it becomes a certain signal to insects. However, what I was most careful about here was the position where I placed the container. I did not place it right next to the plant showing damage. I wanted to place it a little further away and direct their attention there. If you place a strong signal right next to the plant you want to protect, you might instead make that spot stand out. That is exactly why taking it on in a slightly detached location held meaning. When I tried this method, what I gained was not a dramatic miracle. They didn't completely disappear from the garden overnight. However, it was precisely in that I felt reassured instead. Because a truly useful method does not always manifest as an exaggerated change. In reality, the way they were damaged became slightly lighter. The newly emerged leaves were not eaten as concertedly as before. The damage that usually spread in the blink of an eye took a slight breather. That change was quiet, but it was certainly there. And I came to understand more clearly than before what should be aimed for in pest control. Eradicating them to perfectly zero is not the only success. The plants continuing to grow, the damage not spreading severely, the person tending them not feeling cornered every time. If you can bring it to that state, I came to feel that it is a sufficiently valuable management. Looking back, what I truly learned was more than just how to make traps themselves. Handmade traps were tools to catch insects, and at the same time they were tools to readjust my own way of thinking. Not jumping to the strongest thing the moment a problem is visible, but pulling back a little and taking a look, considering what the opponent is drawn to, where it came from, and where it is trying to go. Choosing the necessary mechanism from there. Once that flow becomes ingrained, the garden no longer looks like a place full of enemies as much as it used to. It becomes visible as a place to arrange the overall balance while distinguishing between what to protect and what to keep at a distance. Nowadays, the feelings I have when going out to the garden have also changed considerably. There is no tension like going to look for something bad as there was before. Instead, there is a quiet attention, like finding early signs. Looking at places where moisture remains after the rain. Looking at the direction the wind blows through. Turning eyes not only to the surface of the leaves, but also to the undersides and the base of the plant. The accumulation of such small observations makes the next judgment slightly more accurate. Ultimately, what greatly changed the garden was not a special secret ingredient. It was stopping the attempt to erase everything and beginning to consider what to protect and what to distance just a little. From that moment, the garden ceased to be a mere place of harvest for me. It became a place to look without rushing, to not fight more than necessary, and to learn just the right way of lending a hand.